someone who I've come to know namely through my friend Jennifer Ingram, who is just a huge fan and good friend of yours. And I know we've been on lots of Zoom calls together. But just someone who could speak from a perspective of a person of faith. And I know you, as someone, Brother Pierce, who has created an affirming space for people in your congregation, as someone I thought would have some things to add about the conversation. So I think to start, I have a lot of feelings and opinions about this film. I actually am, honestly, I'm just seeing it with everybody else. So I'm having my moments. I did not have the luxury and time to view it in the way that I wanted to beforehand. So good work. But I guess I want to start with actually Nelson. As someone who was a pastor, what were some of your immediate responses to the film? And I will preface this by saying, I think you both know this, I'm a PK. So there's definitely a lens through which I saw the film. And I'll be honest and candid and courageous here and also say that I have a podcast, and the last episode was also about being the survivor of sexual assault when I was a kid in Dallas, Texas. And so this film resonates with me on so many different levels. So yeah, I'm gonna ask you first, like, what were your immediate responses to it? And then I'm gonna have a question for you, Brother Yaki, as well.
Yeah.
And feel free to introduce yourself in a better way than I did. I just said you're a pastor of a great affirming church in Cincinnati, but I think that's certainly a lot more that you can mention as well.
Well, thank you, Brother Tim. My name is Nelson Pierce. I'm the pastor of Beloved Community Church here in Cincinnati. We are an open and affirming church, and just really grateful to have been able to see the film and to be in this conversation. My first, the very first thought that came as I was watching it was with how much love each of the characters was written with. That all of the characters were written in just such a beautiful, full human lens, and all of their complexity, and it felt really real to me. So I grew up in the church, and actually grew up around a lot of mega churches, and this story is not unfamiliar to me, and so those were the two. Like, the first one was just like, wow, this the level of love and handling of each character, the weaving in of so many themes together and telling this very beautiful and complicated and heartbreaking story.
Mm-hmm.
And then just how real it was, or how real it felt for me. So those were my first impressions of it. And the second thing I'll lift up is how stories like this need to be told, because I think one of the challenges that the Black church in particular still has to wrestle with is the complete level of silence we have about sex, about sexuality, and we have to break that silence. It is killing the church. It is killing the people in the church. It is killing the credibility and witness of the church. And so we have to break that silence and have these conversations.
One of the things that sort of struck me about the film, I think in terms of its complexity, that I really applaud, and I felt I could also identify with it as someone who in some ways could relate to the protagonist or the main character, was this sort of teetering between affirmation of self, right? Like, there were so many moments when he's owning, like, I didn't do anything wrong. This is a natural feeling for me, and a shame that sometimes gets mapped onto people that feel that. And so one of the themes that I kept coming back to was shame, right? And the way that shame, I think there's a way that shame sort of impacts every character in the film, or like almost all of them on different levels for different reasons. But I wondered from maybe, Yaki, this would be a good question to ask you. Was that something you were thinking of in terms of that being a thread through the film, how people navigate the immense love and complexity of that love and the way that shame can kind of show up and interrupt that? It's definitely something that stood out for me in watching it.
Yeah, it's interesting because to almost echo, almost echo what Pastor Pierce said. I think when you think of the way that the church has in many ways, or I should say many ways refuses, right, to acknowledge sex, sexuality, and all the sort of complexities that come with that. And how if this happens to someone, if someone is a victim of sexual abuse, the way that the church usually responds is they shame that person, right? They don't necessarily respond with love, right? They don't reach out and try to embrace that person. They don't try to really heal that person. What they do is they throw that person away. They discard that person. You know, as I was writing this and researching it, there were many stories of people who told me that when they went to their pastors or even their family members and said this happened to them, the first thing out of their mouth was, well, what did you do? And so immediately there's a shame that comes over you because you begin to blame yourself for something that happened to you. And then you start to look at yourself and say, wait a minute, okay, yeah, maybe I did do that wrong. Or maybe I shouldn't have sat there. Maybe I shouldn't have went to that person's house. Or maybe I shouldn't have allowed them into my intimate space, right? And so in terms of my protagonist, yes, I think that's what he's dealing with, because in some ways he has his self-shame too, because again, he's grappling with who he is as a human, right? He's trying to figure out who is he, right? And then I think the family, when you think of shame with them, there's a deep shame that they didn't see, right? That they allowed this man into their life, that they loved him as a father figure. You know, when I think about even the backstory of the film, he married them. He saw them through the worst times of their marriage. He babysat their kid, all of that. And it's almost like, how could we not see this? So this is why the father explodes in the way that he does, because it's not that he's angry with his son, he's angry with himself. Because for him, it's like, how as a man did I not see this? As a father, I'm supposed to protect him. So there's a deep shame in that. And then when you think of the church in general, you know, I think of, there's the scene where the bishop comes to him and says, hey, you know, I don't know the exact line anymore, but he says, we've covered you before. I thought we dealt with this before, right? Because what that lets us know immediately is that, wait a minute, they knew about this. They've always known about this. But again, instead of dealing with it, what they do is they just sort of sweep it under the rug. And so then when these things start to come out, how do we react? Well, we have to almost react defensively, because there's a shame that we didn't do what we were supposed to do when we found out that this thing actually happened to someone. And so, yeah, I think to that end, yeah, I think that is sort of a thread that goes through the entire film.
It's interesting that we're talking about shame, because, you know, this is Black pride, right? Like, and when you think about sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, you know, we're in a space of pride. And I actually kept thinking about it in the context of so much of what people are told that encounter that situation. You know, when my dad, and I'll be honest, and I think I've said this before, and certainly recently in my podcast, the first thing my dad told me, I was 16, not when it happened, I was much younger when it happened, but I started having blackouts. I would remember what happened so vividly that it was literally, I would like black out. And when I finally told my dad what happened, and it was a friend of his who was also a minister, his first words were, well, at least you didn't become no faggot behind it. And I remember in that moment, like wanting to stand up to him and say, well, you know, guess what? Like, you know, I felt like that would be the ultimate dig at my dad, to sort of become what because it was odd to me that he was more concerned about my sexuality than he was about my safety.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is so often a narrative that we see in the Black church, and just the immense denial of the complexity of human sexuality and what we experience. There's some questions that people are starting to chime in, and so I myself identify as probably on the humanist spectrum. I call myself a spiritual agnostic. You can take the boy out of church, you can't take the church completely out the boy. So for all my interest in humanism, like I could still be moved by a gospel song now and again, and every once in a bit I find myself sound like a preacher. For each of you, like where do you identify on that spiritual spectrum, and to what degree has your own sort of self-awareness played into how you identify? And I'll clarify that by saying, I think part of my religious skepticism, part of my being an apologist for the Black church at times, is rooted in the way that they have managed sexuality, in the shaming that they've often done. It's kind of like you go to church often for healing, and a lot of churches are re-traumatizing people, or that's where the trauma has happened. They're going to get healed and they're being re-traumatized. And so curious, especially Yaki as the filmmaker, like where are you on that spiritual spectrum? Because it's, there's a reading of it that can be very sympathetic to the church as still a good place. But then there's also a way, I think about the way that we talk about pastors, right? And the congregation are the sheep. And that always bothered me as a kid. I was like, do people realize what they're saying when they say the congregation's a sheep and I'm watching over my sheep? And I was like, okay. Yeah, like where, to what degree is that metaphor an indictment of the Black church or an affirmation of the Black church?
Well, I think it's both. I'm a very Christian man,
Okay.
and am a believer. But because I'm a believer, and because I believe that the church should be and can be a place of healing, a place of affirmation, a place where people should be able to come and be themselves, a place where people should be able to come and be healed, because I believe that is actually the original function of a church. Mm-hmm. That's why I think I'm able to be critical of it, because I have been in the church my whole life and I have watched it change, actually. I think when I was a kid, I felt more of that, right? Anyone could come in. I felt like it wasn't about money, right? I felt like it wasn't about, mega churches. It wasn't about that kind of thing. I really still felt like there was a love for people. Now, it always has had its issues, but I did feel that, and I have watched it sort of, I don't want to say devolve, but in some ways, I've watched it lose its way. And that troubles me because, to your point, Tim, and I feel like if God is looking down at what his church has become, God is not happy. Because we are not, in my opinion, in any way operating the way that we are supposed to operate, right? I even think about, for example, and I'm going to COVID a little bit here. I even think about this whole notion that when you pay tithes, right, to a church, yes, it's to keep up the building or whatnot, but it's also, right, you're supposed to be storing up things, right, so that when people are in need, when there are times of famine, that there is something for the people to have, right? And to be honest with you, as I look around, and I'm not even talking about small churches, I'm talking about big churches now that I know bring in millions of dollars. When I look around at the response to people that are in need now, people who have lost their jobs, people that are food insecure, people who do not have homes, the church cannot even respond to that in the way that I think it should respond, because again, we have lost our way and we have used our resources in a way that we should not be using our resources. Why in the world do I need a 50,000 seat church when I have congregants who can barely afford to pay their $500 a month rent. I'm confused. And so my point of saying all that is, when I made this film, it was both coming from a place of love for the church, but also honestly coming from a place of criticism of the church as well, because I really want to see the church become the place of refuge that I believe that it was originally designed to be. I mean, I even think about Black people. We can get to the whole thing about how, you know, slave masters gave us Christianity, right? We can go through all that. However, at some point, no matter what they gave us, we found a way to make it work for us. We found a way to create hope in it. We found a way to create love in it. There's a great moment in Toni Morrison's Beloved. If you've not read it, you should. Baby Suggs is in the woods and she is preaching to the people, and she says, love your neck, love your hands, love your hair, love your body, right? She's building the people up in a way that they should be built up. And I believe that that was the original function. Mm-hmm. And we've sort of lost our way. And basically I'm saying, I want to see the church become that again, because to your point, Tim, a lot of people have left the church because they have lost full faith in what the church is to them and really what the church is to the world.
Brother Pierce, what's your response to?
Respectfully, Pastor, by the way.
No. I mean, I think it's such it's a fair, maybe even a generous assessment. I agree wholeheartedly. The influence of money in the church, in the way that the outsized influence that money and capitalism has had in the church has been such a detriment to the Black church, which already had its challenges. And so if there are two things that people in my church hear me talk about on a regular basis, it is liberation. God is calling us to help set all oppressed people free, and we've got to get white capitalism masquerading as Christianity out of the church. Yes. And I say those two things at least twice a month. I think at its best, the church is that place of refuge. And you saw that in the film, right? Where the couple, they were married in the church. Their marriage was restored in the church. The church did provide some spaces, some sense of guidance and healing and health along the way. But it also was this place of, it was a predatory place also. And we have to be attentive to that. You know, I think for me, the question always is, who has the least amount of power? And what does it look like when we prioritize that person, that individual? And that changes what life looks like in churches. Who do we protect, right? The grandmother had some of this in her. The grandmother, she loves her grandson. She wants what's best for her grandson. She's even willing to threaten the elder over her grandson, right? But she's also protective of the church and the institution. And she counsels her daughter, don't take this to the police. Don't put this out in the streets, right? Take care of this in-house. And I think that kind of thinking is always dangerous because it leaves more and more people vulnerable to be attacked. So I'm a Christian. I'm a pastor of a church. Grew up in the church and struggled with it. Struggled with a church that, for me, was losing touch with reality. And was, I started preaching at the age of 13. And so I had this moment where I had to figure out what the rest of my life was going to be about. And there was a temptation for me to leave and walk away, not because I didn't believe in God anymore, but because there were so many problems in the church. And I had a moment of clarity where I thought, if I walk away from this, who's left to help steer the ship? And so I made a commitment to dedicate my life to doing the work of social justice and liberation from within the walls of the church, because it can be such a powerful force for good if we can do this thing right, if we can love people and center that, if we can be a place where we set aside our resources to help people, and focus less on building up the building or the ministry or the name or reputation of the church, and focus more on the people, that we have the power to do good. And so this is 2020, 2010, 2005, 6, 7. I was working with an organization out of Washington, D.C. called the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And we had a curriculum specifically designed for Black churches to help Black churches talk about sex and sexuality, because these are conversations that just aren't being had. And so this is, to me, this is part of the work, is how do we elevate the Black church? How do we push the understanding of what it means to be church, and recapture some of that original sense of what it meant to be community, and define that community in ways that are more open and more inclusive, and more loving.
I'm wondering, it's interesting, a couple of podcasts ago, I did an interview with Dr. Tama. You might have heard of her, Dr. Tama Bryant, Jamal Bryant's sister. We're good friends from college, very good friends. And it's always been really interesting, because one of the things that we talked about was this sort of false choice that's created, or maybe a false binary that's created between, seeking spiritual resolve if you happen to be religious or in the church, and mental health. And as I watched the film, I was like, these people don't just need Jesus, they need counseling. Like, right. There was some definite, and I don't say that in a shaming way. I am in therapy. I'm a fan of therapy. I haven't always been. I struggle with depression and mental health issues. I've been very open about that. And I do that because I don't want that to continue to be a stigma. It becomes one of the additional things that we sort of don't talk about, right, in the church. We just say, pray on it, or go talk to pastor. And so I feel like there's a real opportunity, especially when we talk about, there was a moment when I realized that self-affirmation for me as a kid growing up in church, and my dad being the pastor, meant that I had to constantly tell myself that what I was hearing about me was a lie. So, and imagine the space where that message is coming from, being the church, being the authority given to the pastor, the way that the congregation sees that. There's a way that I, as an adult, look at that moment. I look at my younger self and I was like, you were courageous. You were so brave to even try to resist that narrative that was all around, that there was something wrong with you. And I think that that's something a lot of people in the Black LGBTQ community can identify with. I think so very few of us grew up without some kind of grip of religion in the Black church shaping how we come into who we are and our affirmation. There's still people that still, I think, struggle with full self-acceptance. So I guess I'm sort of moving into a space of, beyond the church, like, what responsibility do we have as members in the community, right? Yeah, in our religious spaces, but also beyond that, to affirm people.
I mean, I think we have a huge responsibility, right? I mean, you know, I'm going to even go back to something that Pastor Pierce said. You know, for me, and I have to link all of this stuff to slavery, you know, but when I think about capitalism and the ways in which it sort of creates a level of othering of Black people, right? Capitalism has to create superiority and inferiority, right? And then with that comes this whole idea of, and I'm gonna just call it purity. And what I mean by that is, in some ways, as Black people, we have almost been stripped. This is gonna sound weird to say it, but we've almost been stripped of like a sensuality. We've almost been stripped of a sexuality. We've almost been stripped of anything that is worldly or fleshly, right? Because in some ways, all we had, right, when you think about, again, being enslaved, the only thing we had to hope for was heaven, right? And how do you get to heaven? To get to heaven, you must be pure, right? And so that strips all of any feeling of almost anything away from you, because all you living for, I mean, you still here in church today, right? You're going to get your reward on the other side. No, I want my reward here, right? Because all the white people got their reward here. Why I got to wait? But that's a whole nother thing. But my point in saying that is that I think we have a responsibility, as you said, Pat, to affirm the least amongst us, because ultimately that's what Jesus did, right? Jesus literally came for the least of us, to save us, to help us, to heal us, to walk us through. And at some point, for some reason, the Black church kind of forgot about that. And even if you're not in the church now, I feel like most Black people have been influenced by the church in some way, because most of our lineage, if we look back at it, somebody was in the church and somebody brought those ideologies into the home, into wherever we were. And so you see this whole thing of not helping, I hate to say it, the least amongst us, permeating our communities. But for me, and I hope I ain't going on no tangent here, it also goes back to this whole notion, for me, of what white supremacy is. And what white supremacy is really good at doing is dividing and conquering. So what they have done is they have turned us against one another. And so not only are we trying to, like, you know, fight for the one little piece of bread that they're going to throw us because we feel like only one of us can have it, but then what we do is in our communities is we don't take care of each other the way that we need to. And that has everything to do, for me, with, like, for example, I had a friend of mine who told me his story of being molested when he was young, and he went to the pastor. And it wasn't even necessarily about just blaming him, but it was about this whole notion of, hold on, we have to save this man who you're accusing because of his status, because of who he is, because losing you, young man, won't make us lose as many others as losing him, because he brings, I don't know, a level of not only money, but he brings people, and he brings a level of notoriety. And so if we lose him, then maybe we lose souls. Not even thinking about, wait a minute, what about this young man who was violated, right? And so again, I think within the walls, we have a responsibility, and outside of the walls, we have a responsibility. Because, you know, I mean, I preach to the choir here, but you know, African-American community, we are extremely homophobic, right? And when I begin to even think about that, the ways in which even me as a kid, the things that you hear, that in many ways you have to unlearn when you get out into the world, because you actually do look at people who are in the LGBTQ community when you're young, you look at them as weird, because guess what? That's what you were taught, right? And so you have to almost get out and unlearn a lot of these bad things that sadly you learned in the walls of a place that was supposed to be refuge, in the walls of a place that was supposed to be preparing you to love everyone, when in fact they don't realize, no, you're actually telling me to love people that are like this, but don't love these other people. And so again, I think not only do we have a responsibility to everyone, but we also have a responsibility to find a way to create transformation within our communities and transformation within our churches, because until we do that, you know, I think we're going to find ourselves back in the same place over and over again. It's going to just be a cycle.
I think about radical honesty and what radical honesty could look like, not only in religious context, but also in secular spaces. And part of that is the ability to be real and honest about trauma or about situations that have happened, right? Like, so, what is it? 1 out of 4 girls, 1 out of 6 boys will experience sexual assault as a kid. And most of those children will only tell one other child their age and not tell an adult, because if the adult perpetuated the thing against you, why would you trust an adult?
Mm-hmm.
What would it mean to cultivate and create spaces where not only radical, because radical honesty has to also come with radical grace, right? And radical, like the ability to say, whatever you got to tell me, I can hold it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to be okay. I have an interesting take on homophobia in the Black community, because I think it's about as shallow as a lot of our religiosity, right? And a lot of what we spew and put out is just what we've heard. But when you really ask people to get behind it, I remember asking my mom, if love was so good, then why was it bad for 2 men to love each other? I was a kid when I asked her this. And she didn't really assume anything about me. She just thought, oh, this kid is being philosophical, trying to like rack my brain about stuff. She said, well, it's just because that's what the Bible says. And I said, well, Mom, what do you think? And I remember she was stuck, because all of a sudden I was asking her to have an opinion independent of, and you know how Black people are, well, the word says, right, but then there are all kind of contradictions in the way that they're interpreting the word sort of fit them. And I feel like there's an opportunity when people are in spaces where they see affirmation and inclusion. I'm really about, what does Black inclusion look like? Like, It's been one of the beautiful things I've seen in the protests around Black lives in this iteration that I haven't seen as much of before. The acknowledgement of Black trans women in spaces, by people that aren't necessarily even LGBT, right? Like just sort of creating space and trying to center Black trans women in the discussion about Black lives. I feel like amid the struggle that we're having, we are having a moment where there is a radical recognition of who we need to be to actually be able to embrace revolutionary change and liberation as a people, and that we don't have the luxury of leaving some people behind.
Yeah.
So yeah, just curious about, someone asked a question, so I'm also filling some questions here. Brother Nelson, have you ever thought about teaching gender and sexuality in church? And I think that's a really important question, because I think some of the shame is rooted in this, to your point, Yaki, right? We strip ourselves of sensual sexual beings, right? And although sensuality and sexuality isn't all of who we are as LGBTQ people or even straight people, it is a part of who we are. And I feel like there's that tension there between, well, how can you affirm me when you shame sex, when you shame sensuality in general? And that's something, and yet Black people are very sensual sexual beings, right? So again, another kind of contradiction that butts heads with our reality. How do we embrace, to go back to the radical transparency, that radical honesty that's actually rooted in love, and say, we're going to be real with each other because we need to love each other. And I need to know who you are, because I can't preach to you. I can't support you. I can't fight for you if I don't know you.
Yeah. So I would, in terms of thinking about it for our church, I would say, I remember one of the best sermons. I had a co-pastor for a number of years, and one of the best sermons I remember from him was on Valentine's Day. It was a Sunday. I think Valentine's Day was on a Sunday that year, and he took scriptures out of the Songs of Solomon, which is a completely sensual book. And, I know there are some preachers who will try to spiritualize it and make it holy and say that, this is a book between the church and Jesus. But it's some really steamy stuff that is said in that book. And so he takes the scriptures and he has them on pieces of paper, and he gives to people as they come in. And so, and he has them numbered, and he's, read it, read your scripture, and, put some umph in it. And so he's having people, and at first, people are like a little embarrassed and they're laughing, but they get into it like throughout it. And so he talks about the importance of us being whole people and not ignoring this part of ourselves. This is great. It's on our YouTube page. You can go back. It's a Valentine's Day sermon. I'm just leaning into that more myself. And so, like, I've had a couple of challenges or a couple of things that have been roadblocks for me. I've been willing to do this in other churches more so for my own. One, because of my age. I just turned 40 a couple of years ago. And so I started pastoring at 20. And so I was younger. And then I've been single my entire life. I'm engaged, and trying to figure out what marriage looks like, what it looks like to get married in the midst of COVID. And so as a young single preacher, I always felt uncomfortable talking too much about sex or sexuality, mostly because I had so many examples of people doing it badly or poorly or with ill intention. And I just didn't want to ever be confused for that. And so I stayed away from it in my own church. But there are times when, people would bring me in to help them unpack it. So now that I've got a fiance, and I feel a little bit more comfortable doing that work within our own church. I'll be honest. I am learning about gender. Mm-hmm. I can be conversant in conversations about sex and sexuality in the church. I feel comfortable in that conversation. Gender it's new. I'm getting my legs underneath me. My fiance is so much better at that conversation. And oftentimes, like, I will have her proofread my sermons before I preach it to help screen for language. And so I'm working, that's a growing edge. But yeah, my hope is to be able to have these conversations more robustly in our church, and help other churches to be able to have them as well.
And I think it's important. I mean, one, the difference between sex and gender, right? And when we talk about Black inclusion and radical inclusion, what is a conversation about gender look like in church? Because churches are heavily gendered, right?
Yes.
I mean, in so many ways. And so especially the consideration that gender is a lot more complicated than we thought of it, right? And yet there are also ways that gender has been there have been safe spaces for lesbians on the Ursha board, right? Mm-hmm. There have been safe spaces for gay men in the choir and churches. And yet there is not, I think what I like about the question is, what responsibility do religious spaces, the Black church, have to actually educate people on the fundamentals, right? It's hard to have a conversation about sexuality and gender when people don't actually even understand the terms.
That's right.
That's right. And so I think there's a real opportunity to have those conversations.
Yeah, so the church has been operating under a don't ask, don't tell policy long before Clinton, made that law. And so as long as you didn't talk about it.
It was in the church before it was in the military.
It absolutely was in the church. As long as you didn't talk about it, people knew. And
like in the film, like if people knew.
Just keep it, just don't rub it in nobody's face. And You know,
which is really interesting in the month of Pride, right? We're talking about Black Pride.
yes.
And I think that is one of those problematic elements. I think,
Yeah.
talking about Cincinnati Black Pride in particular, because Cincinnati historically has been, and it was a place that I said I would never move back to for a long time, because I was actually told by somebody when I moved here, Tim, that they don't like your kind there. You're too out, you're too vocal, they don't do that in Cincinnati. Well, that's not true anymore, at least. And I don't think it's ever been. I think there have always been people who've been out, right? Like some of the people that drew me back to the city have been, out Black, gay men for a while. But I do think that there's something about the acknowledgement and the naming of that that is really rooted in why I think having pride is really important. Because I think, to go back to shame, if we're talking Black people and freedom, right, to what extent does our shame and the way that we shame each other, be that around economics, around orientation, gender identity, to that, like how we create the divisions, it's usually something, well, what can I shame someone for? I used to think that my dad would talk about homosexuals in the pulpit to divert from his meanderings, as a minister himself, and how many siblings I got out there that that I still don't know about, right? And that's real. I think it evolved a kind of healthy skepticism of because I go home with the man that done bless all y'all and y'all done fell out, right?
Right.
But I think I'm able to see the humanity in that in a way that's actually productive. And I think that has application outside of the church context when we talk about organizing. And I want to talk a little bit about Black lives and sort of this moment that we're in, where the Supreme Court's making these decisions about LGBT employment protections, which are favorable. But I had a Black trans woman say to me, well, how can I be worried about getting fired when I can't even get hired?
Right.
Like employment protections don't mean a lot for me if my body is being stopped at the door because I don't look like, or if people don't understand gender identity enough to know that I'm someone that's just capable and needs a job and wants to provide for my family as well.
Yeah, I think it's sorely needed, and I think it's one of the places where, as the church, we need to listen well and invite people to come in. I think it's one of the challenges is that the church has not always fared well in places that we don't excel, and it's hard often to bring people from the outside to teach us. We like to be the ones teaching people. And this is just a place where we are late and hopefully not completely last to the party. But we need to bring people in to have these conversations to help us to understand but I think I would agree with you. One of the things that I think is so powerful in this moment, and it also speaks to what I appreciated most about the film, is that there is so much Black love just pouring out all over all Black people, and affirming and lifting up. And there's always the chatter, but there are people who've done the dressed up in suits in March because they felt like there was an image that they wanted to portray, and then there have been people who have been out cursing the police and everything in between, artists and people dancing, and all kinds of ways people are showing up in this space, and it is all beautiful. And the beauty is, I hope we're learning, it seems like we're learning that we can support all of it and love all of it and show up the way that we feel called and best to show up. And it is, you know, it's what I loved the most about this movie is I was always waiting for the movie to make one person, to villainize one person.
Mhm.
You know, as soon as the dad gets into the fight, and the dad hits the son, and you know, and hits the mom in the fight, and then I'm like, okay, this is the dad's gonna be the, you know, the villain, but he's not. He comes back and he reconciles with his family, and he's trying to love his son through it, you know, with his mistakes, and that is a beautiful picture of what's possible, right? That we can love ourselves and love one another through the challenging conversations that we need to have, through the things that we need to learn, and do that in a way that recaptures the soul of who we are, that loving sense of who we are.
But we got to be able to have those conversations. We have to create space to invite them, and for that to be uncomfortable. And I was going to ask Yaki, have you ever shown or screened this in a church? and what was that like?
I have not, and the interesting thing is, I will say this though, a lot of churches invited me to screen the film. But when it came down to actually making it happen, they didn't do it. And for a while, I was so confused about that. And I remember the moment of clarity when I was invited to Baltimore to the Black Psychiatrists of America conference. And so they screened the film, and in the room after the film, there was, you know, counselors, clergy, and everything in between. And I'll never forget, there was a woman there on the front row, and she said, you know, this is powerful. I would love to show it in my church. She says, but what do I do after I show it?
Mm-hmm.
What is the conversation? Do you have a pamphlet? Do you have a study guide? Do you have anything? Because I don't quite know what I'm going to do after the credits roll, and I have 5 people stand up and say, hey, well, you know, the dude over there did this to me. Well, you know, the woman, right? I don't quite know how I'm going to handle that. And I even doing the research, I understood that, but I think hearing her say it, I realized that one of the reasons why the church can't deal with this in the way that it needs to be dealt with it is because it goes back to your comment earlier about shame, but also blame. Because I think what happens is when it happens, you immediately start to ask yourself that hard question, well, what part did I play in the matter? And then that just makes you shut down, because then there's guilt in that. And then there's fear in that. And then there's, wait a minute, do my kids hate me now because maybe I didn't notice the signs, or did I say something that made them feel like it was their fault, right? And so instead of dealing with any of that and having that conversation, I love what you just said, Pastor Pierce, about, because that's a loving conversation. It's a very difficult conversation, but it's a very loving conversation. I even think about the conversation that we're having right now around race, you know, and I'm a dean of diversity at the university. And it's interesting having these conversations with my white brothers and sisters, because what I'm realizing is a lot of the resistance to having the conversation is that the minute that I start to speak to you about it, a mirror comes up, and then you have to begin to look at yourself. You have to ask yourself those hard, oh, wait a minute, maybe grandpa was a racist. Ooh, maybe when I said that I was being microaggressive. Oh, when I caught that person that oh, wait a minute. You know, and so then you start saying to yourself, oh, I have actually, right, participated in these racist things, or I have actually participated in shaming this person when this thing happened to them. And so I can't have an open forum about this because it's going to bring too much shame and blame, and I can't handle that. Yet, again, as painful as the conversation is, to your point, it's a loving conversation, because I think in order for there to be change, we got to go through pain first.
Yeah.
Right? It's like giving birth, right? It's painful, it's bloody, it's kind of nasty, right? However, at the end of it all, there's something beautiful that comes out of that. And I think the church is going to have to be willing, as you said, they're late to the party, but they're going to have to be willing to come to the party.
Yeah.
And then also be willing to deal with all of the things that come with being so late to the party. Because there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be coming back into the doors and say, wait a minute, you're not getting off that easy. Because remember when you did that. Remember
Right.
when you said that? Let's put all that out on the table and deal with that. But I think if we can actually begin to have those conversations, then we can move to a place, you know, of healing and wholeness.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
No, one of the things that came to mind for me, and I know we're getting close to the closing of it, was I did finally, eventually, as a writer, write about what happened with me. And it was interesting because, you know, I started moving away from language like molestation and sort of part of sort of living into the truth of my experience was saying like, wow, like because I was a kid, it wasn't rape or it wasn't sexual assault, right? The way that we do that, right? We soften it with the word like molestation, like that sounds a little nicer when you're talking about kids. But I needed, when I first wrote about it, there's a narrative in the church that that sexuality is formed in that moment, right? That like somehow because that happened, which I thought quite powerfully that the boy is kind of owning that like, no, I have some agency here and there is something that I'm exploring and owning and wanting to affirm. That still doesn't make it right, or it doesn't excuse someone from taking advantage, right? Like someone takes advantage of a young girl who's, you know, 15 or whatever, you know, because she is exploring and coming into her sexuality. It doesn't make the sexuality wrong, but we don't do that with straight people, right? It's queer people that get, you know, demonized for that connection. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to reconcile is like part of the shaming. Back to my dad. My dad was, at least you didn't become like, it was almost like you made it. And part of why you made it is because you didn't become gay behind this, right? And I think for me, that was just such a powerful, disturbing statement for him to make. And I still think it speaks to a notion, even notions of what it means to be a strong Black man in our community, or to be whatever. Like there are ways that we have really bought into a really colonized notion of what manhood is, or what womanhood is, or what gender is. And I actually think that's one of the things I love about our trans and non-binary community. They shake all that up. They shake it all up. And they make it really uncomfortable. We have to have uncomfortable conversations, and things don't quite make sense in the way that we would like them to be really neat and clean. And I think there's real opportunity in that. Just some closing thoughts before we say goodbye for both of you. Why don't we start with you, Pastor Pierce?
Yeah, I think the what I would say in closing is number one, for anybody who watched this and identified with the hurt, the abuse, the shame, you know, one of the things that I loved about that the film tried to say is that that people aren't God, and the hurt that's caused by people does not mean that God wants to hurt you or was trying to hurt you or sanctions that hurt. And so I hope that people are on a healing journey, or if they have not started it, that they will get on a healing journey, so that we can come to a place where we can do the internal healing work, so we can continue the healing work in the community. And then secondly, I want to figure out how we get this screened at Beloved Community Church, because these are the conversations that we need to have. And, you know, and so, yeah. And if we need to write a church guide so that churches who want to have this can have the conversations, I will help write the church conversation guide, because we need to be grappling with these conversations in real ways.
Hey, so I'm gonna answer that second question, and I'm gonna have my thoughts. All you gotta do is invite me, and I'm there. And you know, in terms of writing that guide, I would love it. You know, when we first started to tour this film, we partnered with the Rape Crisis Center of San Antonio, and I will never forget, in that screening, we had counselors. outside. So after you came out of the screening, they literally were lined up. And there were people who I know had never told anyone that this had happened to them, had never expressed this to anyone. After the film was over, they were outside talking to those counselors and really trying to find ways to process not only what they just saw, but also process what sort of it triggered for them, right? And so I say all that to say that I would love, and I mean this wholeheartedly, Pastor Pierce, we could sit down and do this together, because I would love to see this screened at churches. I would love for there to be follow-up with the guide, and then I would love for there to be connection to real help when people need it, right? Because it kind of goes back to your comment, Tim, and I think sometimes in the church, we deal with the spiritual part of it, right? But we don't really deal with the psychological and mental part of it, because that is traumatic, right? That is a traumatic event. I mean, it happened to me. My babysitter, a woman, did this to me. And it took me years to even like let that come out of my mouth, because again, I really, first of all, didn't understand it. And I was like, was I supposed to like that? Because it was, you know, like I didn't really know what that was even all about. But again, who was I going to tell, right? Who was I going to talk to? Who could I express that to? Who would understand the feelings that I was having, right? And so because I felt like there was no one there for me to have that conversation with, what do? You just shut down and you try to find a way to process it yourself. And you already know you can't necessarily process something like that yourself, right? Because you don't even really quite understand what it is, right? And so I hope that when people see this film, to your point, that one, they don't do a one church is every church kind of thing, right? There is a church out there for you, right? And I, I think even for me, like I said, I grew up in the church, and then there were moments where you just kind of go and because you're supposed to do it, right? But then there's that moment where you find that other church where you're like, no, I'm supposed to be here because these people are saying something that speaks to me, right? It doesn't feel like it's just sort of something that I do because I have to go to church on Sunday, but there's a deep desire for me to be here because they're speaking truth to me, right? And I think that's what I want people to know is like, don't just immediately, run away because that thing happened to you. God didn't do this to you, right?
Right, but I also think that can also be important though. Like I know for me, like I think it's a fight for your joy and for your affirmation sometimes to say, I need a break. Like
I think a break is fine.
It's not,
right?
not the moment, it's not the time. And until such a place, and that place could be radically different. I always joke about the spaces and places where we find community, where we find home and love, right? And can that exist outside of sometimes the dogma and the religiosity of the church? Because ultimately, like what I most miss when I find myself missing is the community, right? Is a space, but I want a church where if something happens to a kid, they can walk in and be like, Mr. Timmon, this happened to me. And they can say that with like the confidence that they're not gonna be shamed. Yeah. They're not gonna care what their sexuality is as a result of it. And I think, we have a ways to go, but I think this film really helps us identify the kinds of spaces we can create if we're going to really, really talk about Black inclusion, Black freedom. So I just want to thank you both for, sharing your time. Nelson, we got a lot of conversations to have. I also want to work on the toolkit. I worked with A24, and so there's an educator toolkit that I helped design based on Moonlight.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So if you go to, and I'll actually chat in the link, but if you go to It Gets Better /Moonlight or something like that, it's actually, they actually took the toolkit, refined it, and it's on a platform, and it's a whole guide about how you look at films like this, because I think you're right, like people need to be guided. I mean, this can be a really heavy film. Like I said, when we first started, I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna say about it. Damn, I should have watched that film like a day ago. And I felt the same way when I saw Barry Jenkins' Moonlight. Like I was like, well, I got a lot of thoughts right now. I don't quite know what to say about it, but I think that's what good film does. And so thank you for sharing your gift.
Yeah. Thank you.
Real quick, Brother Yaqui, what's up next? Is there a project that we need to be looking out for?
Yeah, so I just created a new short called Dear Bruh, a baptism, a eulogy, a call to action. And it is a short film that in many ways is a love letter to the men who have been lost or murdered, executed through racist, crimes via police, white vigilantes, whatever it is. And it was really my way of processing really the deep hurt that I feel every time I have to see one of those crimes. And also this whole notion of say this name, say that name. It's so hard to keep saying people's names every other week.
Yep.
Because it reminds you of how fragile your life is, And so anyway, that's out. It was crazy. I sat in my garage. I made this film, and then it's Vogue magazine reached out, the Criterion Collection reached out. So people have been writing about it, but it's called Dear Bruh. You can find it on YouTube. I have a web series called The Beginning and Ending of Everything on a platform called A Space for Creators. You can find that as well. During the quarantine, I've been shooting an anthology series called Love in the Time of Corona. That's going to be out very soon, which is pretty cool because we shot it using all social distance. But that's a long conversation. And then, I'll be working on my next feature. I'm not teaching next year because I'm gearing up to shoot basically the follow-up to Wolf. I haven't shot a feature film since I shot Wolf. It's all been shorts and web series in the interim, but it's time for me to really get back into the feature-length world.
Cincinnati's a beautiful city, and it's a lot of good scenery here, and we love your work, so come on back here and shoot. I've got some good actors and actresses for you, and some people to join. So thank you.
Help me raise the money, and I'll come back.
There's plenty of that here too, believe it or not. So this will actually be for those that are still watching and hanging in here with us. And for you as well, people can watch this entire film festival throughout the entire weekend. I think it will expire at midnight on Sunday or something like that. So people can go back, they can actually regulate what they watch when they watch it. That's the really great thing about this platform. I want to thank Adam and Black Alphabet and the other board members that might be watching. Born in Chicago, because you would go sometimes to LGBT film festivals and you might see one Black film and you're just like, okay, like I don't quite relate to everything here. And you could go to Pan-African or Black film festivals and there might be one LGBT oriented film, right? And so the idea was like, let's create a space where both of our identities are actually affirmed and met. And then as a result of that, like we are able to, like, we have white dominant film festivals come to us and say like, hey, can you suggest some films that we can show? And we have Black film festivals saying we want to actually feature more LGBT work. So that's really great. I also want to recognize the Columbus Black International Film Festival. If you haven't heard or been involved with that, they are also a partner of ours in helping support this work. And yeah, definitely check out Black Alphabet. There's a great catalog. Now we get to add Wolf to that catalog of films that we've shown. But it's a really expansive and great catalog of film that we've done since, Adam, what's the year? Is it 2013? When we had our little meeting on the South Side?
Yeah, it was 8 years. We're coming up on 8 years, so it was about 8 years ago.
Yeah, awesome. And really pleased and happy that Cincinnati is the second city to take on the festival. Now we can actually call it international, Adam. What are some of the other places that have done Black Alphabet?
We've had some kind of offshoot activity in Kenya. We were supposed to move into Kingston, Jamaica this year, but Corona happened. So we are looking at doing some digital work with them or just re-upping next year with them. And we are moving into a few cities across the United States soon as well.
And one of the great things about this virtual platform that I've said a few times is that, there are sometimes, I remember when I walked around a building at Duke City 4 times to see if anybody Black was watching before I went to go see Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied. And it was literally like, okay, is anybody watching? And I remember seeing it, and I walked into that space, you know, a closeted Black man, and I walked out determined that I was going to live my truth, because it was so powerful and meaningful for me. But I think one of the things about the virtual space, there are people that would not go to a Black LGBT film festival. So we don't know who's on this platform watching it virtually. I think it really, the virtual space is beneficial in that it creates a space where people can explore and learn and grow, if they're not yet at that point where they're ready to have that conversation. So appreciate it. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Corey, and everybody else that's been a part. Anastasia has done such great work making sure we got this going on. I should go through the schedule for the rest of the week. So tomorrow we'll be having our Vizazi Torch Awards. It's Vizazi is Swahili generational. And so we have 3 different sets of awards that we give out. We have a Spark Award for people 29 and under, because sparks get the flame going. We have Embers, which is 30 to 49, and then 50 plus are our flames. And that's a way that we recognize the cross-generational contributions of people right here in Cincinnati and in our community. We've added 2 additional awards. The Kaburi Award, which is Swahili for Pride, is given to people that are from Cincinnati who've moved out elsewhere and who continue to have an impact and make us proud. So those are sort of are homegrown here. They've gone somewhere else and done something. You can find out all about that at Cincy Black Pride or Cincinnati Black Pride. That's going to start at 7:30 tomorrow and go to 10. And then we have after party, some grown and sexy DJs playing some house music, some hip hop, some old school. It's going to be a nice little party you can have at your own space and home. On Saturday, we have something called Outside and Pride. And for those that are on the platform, I have all these goodie bags, these pride bags. Now, we're not having an actual party, but you can get a goodie bag with some good stuff in it and go to your house and listen to the DJ on the computer. So we definitely have that going on Saturday, and that followed by an event that I started in 2004 called The Front Porch, open mic, acoustic, soul music, hip hop, and then that will turn into a party after that'll be virtual. And on Sunday, we'll have like an interfaith kind of mini documentary talking about Black LGBT experiences, Muslim faith, Jewish faith, Christian faith. What does that look like? And even potentially myself as someone who, spiritually agnostic, whatever that means. So yeah, join it. Look at the website. We'll keep it up to date. All of these events are free, but we do ask people to donate. You can donate on the website. None of this stuff is free. And so we certainly need that support to continue to bring the programming. And no further ado, I guess that's it. Good night. Be safe. Wear your mask where you need to. Get the hugs that you need to. I'm also not about shaming people who are finding ways in the spaces of safety to negotiate how to get the care they need. So if that's a small gathering at your house and you have the hand sanitizer out and people wear masks, do what you need to take care of yourself, but certainly be safe and take care of each other. All right. Good night.